A record number of young people are being referred to the Children's Gender Service at the Tavistock.
Because, as a psychologist, I felt that if I ever spoke to a family like this, I would immediately be called transphobic.
To be trans, you don't even have to medically transition and you can still be trans.
I'm so confused, my head is going to explode.
35 psychologists have resigned from the Children's Gender Service in London in the last 3 years.
This constant kind of scaremongering that it's a terrifying prospect that these young people are just being happy.
Looking back, there are young people who I now wouldn't necessarily put on medication or sign off on medication.
Now, former NHS staff have warned they are unable to properly assess children having medical treatment for gender dysphoria over fears they'll be branded transphobic.
Sky News research suggests that 35 psychologists have resigned from the Children's Identity Service in London in the last 3 years.
Well, this comes amid surging demand from under-18s for help from NHS gender services, with concerns being raised about a lack of screening, psychological evaluation and long-term follow-ups for young transgender individuals.
Well, Sky's Sally Lockwood has this special report.
What gender am I? It's something many young people are now asking.
The gender of my brain doesn't match up the gender of my biological sex.
And it's become a deeply divisive issue. Divisions even among the young people receiving treatment.
If I couldn't live my life as a male or have the body of a male, I honestly don't think I'd be around by the age of 20, 30.
I had to stop the train. I was like, OK, this isn't right, what we're doing here.
And immense pressure on the clinicians doing the treating.
We can't ever be seen to be a service that can pronounce with great confidence about every young person who comes along. Nobody can do that.
We're exploring the anxieties behind this debate. This is Leo. He's 16 years old and was born female. He now identifies as male.
In my school, I'm pretty sure I'm the only trans person.
Leo first came out as transgender at 11 years old. He began medical treatment 2 years ago, taking drugs to pause his female puberty. Recently, he began testosterone treatment, which does things like lower his voice and promote hair growth.
When I started my periods, that was something that really was an indicator for my parents that things weren't going to change, it wasn't a phase, because that worsened, puberty worsened my mental health, worsened my gender dysphoria. When you're transgender, it's just different. It's excruciating.
The Gender Identity Development Service at the Tavistock is where children like Leo with gender dysphoria are treated on the NHS. That's when the body they're born with doesn't match their gender identity. Sky News research suggests 35 psychologists have resigned from the Children's Gender Service in London in the last 3 years. We've managed to contact 20 of them. Only 6 would speak to us. All 6 said they were concerned about giving hormone treatment to children with gender dysphoria. All 6 felt they weren't able to properly explore underlying psychological factors.
Looking back, there are young people who I now wouldn't necessarily put on medication or sign off on medication.
This was the only clinician prepared to be interviewed. They asked us to change their voice.
I was once working with an executive that felt the gender dysphoria a young person was presenting with was really strong, really intense. So she decided to put the young person forward for the hormone blocking treatment after 2 appointments. Looking back, it was a young person with a history of trauma and direct trauma in terms of abuse. And also there were other things happening to them, and this was not really explored by the clinician.
These views were echoed by others who had worked at the clinic. Therapy is not an option in this service, one psychologist told us. We fear that we have had front row seats to a medical scandal, said another. This is Thomasin. She's 19 years old and was born female. She previously identified as male but detransitioned earlier this year. Thomasin lived many of her teenage years as a boy and was referred to the Tavistock for treatment after reading about gender transition online.
I thought, I didn't meet the requirements, so therefore I must not be a woman. I've got to be something else because I'm not normal. Mainly the thing that was fueling me was that, it's just the fact that I didn't fit in and I didn't know anything, and then slowly was drip-fed this idea that you could change sex. I wanted to have hormones and be a man and have top surgery and be going down beaches and topless and whatever else it was and living my life out like that.
The whistleblower says they saw many female-born patients with underlying issues, such as experiences of homophobia or even a history of abuse.
The numbers started growing from 2012, when we started seeing more females coming forward, and this has happened across the Western world.
And as a psychologist, did you ever feel that you could say to a parent, "I don't believe your child is trans"?
No, and this is one of the reasons why I decided to leave the service, because as a psychologist, I felt that if I ever spoke to a family like this, I would immediately be called transphobic.
It did feel scary at times because you're going down this route of a medicalised pathway, and I did have those little niggles in the back of my mind. I was talking a lot of doubt, and I don't just mean, oh, I'm not sure, I mean, I'm so confused, my head is going to explode.
A record number of young people are being referred to the Children's Gender Service at the Tavistock. There were just 77 patients referred here 10 years ago. By last year, the number had climbed to 2,590 children, the majority female at birth. And they've told us around 3,000 more children are on the waiting list. The clinic sees children under 18, some as young as 3 years old. Around half the children who come here are put on drugs at puberty to essentially pause their physical development. That would be the first step of any medical intervention. The next would be hormone treatment at 16 years old, and any surgical procedures would only happen after they turned 18.
Hello.
Hello, Deb.
We came to speak to senior clinician Bernadette Wren, who told us they fully inform children about the consequences of medical intervention in their teenage years.
The work that we do to really inform these young people as fully as we can what this means to start taking, say, testosterone, in the example, what that means for them physically, what are the irreversible impacts of that, what are the impacts on fertility, what are the possible, to consider the possible impacts on their sexuality, relationships in the future. Of the young people who've perhaps come to us and thought they'd like to review their decision, they, again, one or two, they have always said that they felt we have done everything that we could to make clear to them the gravity, really, of the choice that they're making.
I'd have to talk in depth about my dysphoria. I was asked questions about my future and if I wanted to freeze my eggs, stuff like that, which as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old is quite difficult to think about.
And how did you answer that question?
Personally, my view of it is that I didn't want to because the process I thought would have been quite difficult. I would have struggled because I would have had to go on estrogen, which is obviously not something I wanted for a month, and then there's the process of extracting the eggs and everything. And if I wanted kids in the future, which obviously I'm not certain about, but I could always adopt.
Leo only had to wait 7 months to be seen by the Tavistock, but the waiting list is now 2 years. The psychologist says it's putting immense pressure on the service.
A junior clinician working full-time is expected to carry a caseload of 120 to 130 young people. Compared to child and adolescent mental health services, generic services where the equivalent would be 40 cases. At the moment, there's only one pathway through the service. It's a medical pathway, not a psychological one. But I wasn't aware of this when I joined the service as an enthusiastic LGBTQI ally.
This is Luke. He's 17 years old and was also born female. He now identifies as male. Luke first came out as trans at 14 years old. And when we met, he'd been on the waiting list at the Tavistock for 2 years. Since his referral for treatment, it's been an agonising wait.
I was in such a bad place mentally that I told Mama that I can't go any longer. Like, I'm like in pain, and we were coming out from the GP and I kind of like started tearing up, and like I told her like I can't go any longer. And she started tearing up, and we both started crying, and then she told me that if it is what I need, then we'll go privately.
That was a turning point for Luke, and he set up a phone consultation with a GP he found online. They prescribed him testosterone, which he now applies as a cream. He's essentially changing his body himself.
So how much did the phone consultation cost you?
If I remember correctly, maybe like around £50. I think if you go for like the Skype call session, it's a bit more expensive. But every so often.
So they didn't see you in person?
No.
And they prescribed you testosterone?
Yes.
It's an incredibly dangerous thing to buy any kind of medicines over the internet from a supplier of which you know nothing. It's not accredited in any way. We feel really anxious about young people doing that with or without their parents' consent.
No one knows exactly how many children are buying hormones online and self-medicating, but step-by-step instructions on how to transition are easily available on the internet and social media, along with sites selling estrogen and testosterone. There's no question gender dysphoria is causing concern and confusion for many young people and parents. But there's a crisis in the care available, a service overwhelmed with patients and teenagers trying to bypass the long wait for treatment.
For many young people, gender is simply much more fluid. Children are being encouraged to express themselves outside of the binary male-female stereotypes. Much of the concern expressed to us isn't about whether people should transition or not. It's about the age at which they're medicalised.
It's become a political and often fractious debate. Many of the people who approached us wanted their identities protecting for fear of criticism. And almost every expert we spoke to simply wasn't prepared to comment. The Tavistock say their levels of staff turnover are not unusual for child and adolescent mental health services. In a statement, they said, "We have conducted exit interviews with all departing staff to understand their motivations and identify any areas of concern. The work is demanding and the pressures of operating in a busy service facing a high level of unfair criticism are intense. GIDS supports every young person on a case-by-case basis as an individual." For this generation, gender is a big conversation.
I am becoming the best version of myself. I'm very happy because I'm finally becoming myself.
The fight for personal identity now political.
I don't fit in this, I don't like this, I don't want to be a man.
A difficult journey for parents as well as children.
We were struggling and he was the one putting his arm around me and saying, "It's all right, Mum, I don't expect you to get it straight away." So, yeah.
You must be very proud of him.
I am. Very proud.
And experts on the NHS front line under immense pressure.
We have a very long waiting list, which complicates everything about our engagement with these young people and the help we can offer them.
The answer may be different for each child, but at young ages, many are facing big questions about the body they want for life.
I'm joined now by LGBTQ+ campaigner and non-binary writer Jamie Windust and Debbie Hayton, a transgender woman and also a physics teacher who's in our central London studio. Hello to you both. Jamie, to you first. Lots and lots of issues raised by Sally's report. That final thought about the immense importance of these decisions that are being made at a very young age, decisions that shape the rest of someone's life, decisions about fertility, decisions about gender, and the age at which they are being made. What are your thoughts?
I think one of the biggest things that we've found, you know, this video highlights, is that there is an abundance of young trans people who are accessing these services, but I think the numbers aren't the issue. The issue is the funding and the access to these services.
Because we heard about the long waiting list.
Absolutely. You know, it's between 18 months and 2 years that these young people have to wait. So I think that's one of the biggest issues that I think this piece highlights, not necessarily the fact that there are a lot of people accessing them. There are a lot of problems that force people to have to go private, which is where it can sometimes seem that it gets a bit tricky.
And we saw Luke's story there, who talked about that telephone consultation, paid £50, never seen personally, and then prescribed testosterone. Debbie, your thoughts on this? You know, you transitioned in middle age. Tell us what you think about the age at which many of these children are receiving treatment.
Well, I don't think we should be providing this treatment to children at all. I think it's irresponsible and inappropriate. It's an untested and uncontrolled experiment on these young people. Young people are coming out in numbers as they've never come out before. We need to ask why. The demographic is very different. Traditionally, transsexualism has been male to female. Suddenly, most of these are girls. None of these questions are answered. Instead, a process seems to happen by which promises are made to these young children and then not delivered. And then we're wondering why we have a mental health crisis amongst them.
But on the subject of mental health, Debbie, for a child who identifies as trans, what impact does going through puberty have on their mental health?
Well, it's what puberty is. Puberty is part of our natural development as human beings. I went through puberty, but we're saying to these children, you have a choice about going through puberty. You can go through puberty or not. Never before in history have we ever placed such decisions on such young people. These are adult decisions which we're asking children to make. We would never give these children the chance to have a tattoo and make those decisions, but we're allowing them to make decisions which will affect their fertility. We heard about Leo in the film. Their fertility, they can be sterilised and on medication for life. And these are very young pubescent children.
Jamie, it's too much too soon.
I think what is really important is to know the context with these situations. Puberty blockers are not supplied to young people before they enter puberty. You still have to be 16, you still need parental or guardian consent. So there's still a lot of rigmarole, a lot of assessment from the GIDS on these services. It's not like on the Monday...
Are the puberty blockers not prescribed at an earlier point to stop puberty and then the hormones prescribed at the age of 16?
So through that process, for example, with the Tavistock Centre, they assess based on your personal experience. I think what tends to happen in these circumstances is that a transition, for example, is seen as one path that is blanket for everyone, and there are so many different ways to be trans. You don't even have to medically transition and you can still be trans. So I think this kind of blanket policy that all trans young people are going through this journey is just not correct. It's not what's actually happening.
Debbie, one of the things we heard in the report was some of the psychologists who've resigned from the gender identity clinic saying that they felt they couldn't speak openly about this. They couldn't say to a parent, for example, I don't believe your child is trans, for fear of being transphobic. They couldn't properly explore underlying psychological factors. And given what we hear about the demand on the service, there isn't the time to do that either, is there?
No, there isn't. And people are not asking these questions why children are coming forwards. Why are 3- and 4-year-olds identifying as transgender? Who's told these children they're trans? And so children are being made promises at such a young age that they're really the opposite sex. Children who perhaps are still believing in the tooth fairy are then believing that they're the opposite sex. And then along comes puberty and puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones. This is a disaster in the making. It really is.
Do you not believe then that a child can make that decision at an early age to say that actually I was born in the wrong body, I'm not a girl, I am actually a boy? There was a story I was reading this week about Ash, born a boy, but from the age of 3 knew that she wanted to be female.
But nobody's born in the wrong body. Nobody does any research into why these children are identifying as transgender. And as you've said, the moment people do start asking the questions, you're shut down as transphobic, bigoted, hateful. And this is the questions we need to ask. Why is it considered transphobic to ask questions about what is going on with these young people?
Jamie, are you concerned about the lack of open dialogue that is able to be had?
I think the biggest problem that I have with the dialogue is not necessarily its openness, but it's the connotations that young people exploring their gender identity is in some way a danger or worrying. There's nothing troubling for me to hear that young people are exploring their gender identity and actually feeling happier.
It's not so much the exploring that identity, is it? It's the medicalising of it.
Well, that is, you know, that in turn leads to that process. And what I find more stressful and more kind of damaging is hearing the stories of the young people that are facing the long waiting times, or the fact that they have to go privately, or the fact that the current system doesn't allow them to move forward. You know, the GRA reform is to hopefully demedicalise this process and create a safer and more human environment that these young people can access. So I think the conversation, yes, we do need to be having it, but this constant kind of scaremongering that it's a terrifying prospect that these young people are just being happy, that's where I have the problem.
Jamie Windust and Debbie Hayton, thank you both very much indeed for your views this afternoon.
Thank you.